Worldwide attention was drawn to the possible value of aloe after the Second World War, when skin burns of victims of the atomic bombs on Japan were evidently successfully treated with aloe vera gel, but you don't really know for sure until you put it to the test. Today, most radiation burns are caused by doctors giving radiation treatments for cancer. This can cause severe, painful, scarring skin reactions that can interfere with the therapy, yet sadly we are yet to come up with good prophylactic skin treatment measures to prevent this radiation-induced skin toxicity. Enter aloe vera gel, used on skin burns for centuries. So, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial was performed aloe vera gel versus a placebo gel, and no benefit was found. After the completion of the study, though, many involved clinicians felt that the patients participating in the trial had less skin inflammation than normal across the board, suggesting that maybe the placebo gel was helping too. So, to their credit, they actually ran a second experiment to see if aloe was better than nothing. And once again, aloe appeared to have no effect at all. In both trials, the severity scores were virtually identical, meaning aloe vera gel simply didn't work. What about an even larger trial? Hundreds of patients randomized to aloe vera gel, or just like plain skin lotion, not only during the radiation treatments, but extending for 2 weeks afterwards. And the skin lotion placebo worked even better in terms of reducing skin peeling and pain, and so yet again, aloe failed. And indeed, if you do a systematic review of all such studies, there's simply no evidence suggesting aloe is helpful. Head and neck cancer patients suffer the additional burden of radiation damage to the lining of their mouth and throat, and aloe didn't seem to help with that either. OK, so aloe may not help with cancer treatment, but how about helping with the cancer itself? In a Petri dish, aloe inhibits the proliferation of human breast cancer cells, cervical cancer cells, and lung cancer cells. So is aloe vera a natural cancer soother? Unfortunately, in vitro potency, meaning like Petri dish studies, often fail to translate to the clinic because the compounds aren't bioavailable enough to build up to test tube levels within the tumor in the body. So while some studies suggest an anti-proliferative effect on cancer cells in vitro, evidence from clinical trials is currently lacking. Until 1998. 50 patients with advanced untreatable cancer treated with melatonin, which they thought might boost anti-cancer immunity, or melatonin with about 20 drops of an aloe extract twice a day, which they made by soaking 1 part aloe leaves to 9 part 40-proof alcohol. And the aloe group appeared to do better, nearly twice as likely to either have a partial response or at least some stabilization, and, the most important outcome, improved survival. Here's the survival curves. So, for example, 6 months out, 80% of the aloe group were still alive, whereas more than half of the non-aloe group were dead. The researchers conclude that melatonin and aloe may be recommended in patients with very advanced, untreatable cancers, since it didn't seem to cause any bad side effects and seemed to help. We don't know if the aloe would help on its own, though, and a subsequent study by the same group muddied the waters further by adding a third component, a tincture of myrrh as well. But the main problem with these studies is that they weren't randomized. So if sicker patients were intentionally or unintentionally placed in the non-aloe control group, that could explain the apparent aloe benefit. The problem is there's never been any randomized studies of aloe for advanced cancers until now, or at least 2009. For a half-century, aloe vera gel processors and distributors, armed with biblical quotes and anecdotal testimonials, have sought recognition for their products, too often accompanied, however, by misinformation, and none of which more elaborate than promoting aloe vera for the treatment of cancer. But check out this recent case report, a 64-year-old Hispanic woman with a tumor on her eyeball, which looked like a classic case of ocular surface squamous neoplasia, a type of eye cancer, and therefore surgery was recommended to remove it. But the patient declined the surgery and instead initiated the use of concentrated aloe vera eye drops 3 times a day, based on a friend's suggestion. Just some off-the-shelf aloe vera gel product. And to the doctor's surprise, the lesion showed significant improvement after just 1 month, and 2 months later it went from this to gone completely. At the time of writing, it was 6 years later, and it appeared the cancer was gone and stayed gone. Now, normally you'd go in and cut it out with wide margins to make sure you get it all, because despite the best efforts of the ocular surgeon, recurrence rates as high as worse than a flip of a coin have been reported because there's little bits of cancer you miss on surgery. And here, there's this tumor that disappeared without surgery. Are we sure it was cancerous, though? Well, she refused a biopsy, so we don't know for certain. However, it did have all the kind of defining characteristics, and so to see it disappear without any side effects and stay gone is pretty extraordinary. Surgical resection still remains the recommended treatment, but at least there's an option for patients to try if they don't want to go down that route. Of course, this was just a single case report, no control group. It's not like she had tumors in both eyes and just tried the aloe on one. There was a controlled study suggesting aloe could prolong survival in those with advanced untreatable cancer, but it wasn't a randomized controlled study. But a decade later, there was. Hundreds of patients with metastatic cancer randomized to receive chemotherapy with or without aloe. And the aloe group had 3 times the number of complete responses, significantly greater objective tumor responses, and 2/3 at some level of disease control, compared to only half in the non-aloe group. But does that translate out into improved survival? Yes. For example, at 1 year, 70% of the aloe group was still alive, whereas most of the non-aloe group was dead. And as a bonus, the chemo was better tolerated in the aloe group, less fatigue, for example, and better maintenance of their immune system. So given the better disease control, given the better survival, this study seems to suggest that aloe may be a successful add-on therapy in terms of both tumor regression rate and survival time. Now, this was a randomized controlled study, but not a randomized placebo-controlled study. It's not like the control group was getting like some fake aloe drink. So some of the tumor response may have been like a mind-over-matter placebo effect. Now, there are potential downsides. As I explained in a previous video, swallowing aloe can, in rare cases, trigger liver inflammation and cause electrolyte imbalances due to diarrhea or vomiting. For example, there was a case reported of an aloe-induced low potassium in a patient with breast cancer, which rapidly resolved once she stopped the aloe, thought due to the laxative effect aloe can have. If you want to talk to your doctor about giving it a try, note this was not aloe vera, but aloe arborescens, a tree-like aloe that can grow to be like 10 feet tall. The concoction they made was a mixture of about 2/3 of a pound of fresh aloe leaves to a pound of honey, plus about 3 tablespoons of 40% alcohol, given orally at a dose of 2 teaspoons 3 times a day, starting 6 days prior to the onset of chemo. The creation and promotion of female sexual dysfunction as a mental disorder seems like a textbook case of disease-mongering by the pharmaceutical industry, harkening back to the first DSM, Psychiatry's Diagnosis Manual, which listed frigidity as a mental disorder, along, of course, with homosexuality. The latest manifestation is hypoactive sexual desire disorder, a disease invented by drug companies. It's like when Prozac was about to go off patent, the company sponsored the creation of a new mental illness to market a drug called Serafem, which was simply Prozac repacked in a pink capsule. The condition previously known as shyness was branded as social anxiety disorder so they could get kids on Paxil. There are certainly women who are troubled by low libido, but there's no reliable scientific evidence that hypoactive sexual desire disorder is a real medical condition. And women can get diagnosed with it even with a normal libido. A woman highly interested in sex, just not, for whatever reason, with her current partner, can still qualify for the diagnosis and the drug. Even a woman who is perfectly satisfied with her sex life may still qualify if her partner isn't. Our story begins in 2009, when a drug company tried to get a failed antidepressant called flibanserin approved to treat hypoactive sexual desire disorder. The only problem? It didn't work. It was resubmitted again after more study and was still rejected, as was the appeal. But in 2015, the FDA approved the drug. What changed? Nothing about its efficacy. It didn't work any better. What changed is that the drug company that bought it helped launch an AstroTurf fake grassroots advocacy group, Even the Score, which lobbied for approval under a feminist rubric. Men have their drugs, why don't women get any sex drugs? Which was exposed as kind of a bitter irony. But hey, within 48 hours of FDA approval, the drug was sold for a cool $1 billion in cash. Very satisfying for the drug company, but what about the women who take the drug, now sold as Addyi? Not much. The drug just doesn't work as advertised. Yes, it may stimulate monkeys to groom each other more, but when researchers dug up the unpublished data about the drug, any clinical benefit was found to be marginal, and the drug was found to have significant adverse side effects. Besides being ineffective, it can be dangerous. Combining it with alcohol can cause dangerous hypotension and fainting, a problem so serious that the FDA put a black box warning on it, its most serious safety alert on the label, that of course no one reads. Even without alcohol, it can cause severe drops in blood pressure levels and cause sudden, prolonged unconsciousness. Now, serious side effects might be acceptable in some kind of cancer wonder drug or something, but are entirely unacceptable in a drug given to healthy women for an invented condition. Are there any safe and natural solutions? Well, there's lots of studies on diet and men's sexual health, but what about women's? I've previously explored the evidence about women with high cholesterol levels, reporting diminished sexual function across a number of dimensions. This could explain why a more plant-based diet, rich in a variety of whole plant foods, might be effective in ameliorating sexual function issues in women, as it does in men. More whole grains, beans, vegetables, and fruit, and less meat, dairy, and sugar associated with a reduced risk of erectile dysfunction. Because of the anatomy and physiology of sexual responses are actually quite similar between the two, it can have a similar effect. You can measure clitoral engorgement with fancy MRI techniques within minutes of exposure to an erotic video. And we know now that lubrication is all about blood flow, too. Within the sexually aroused vagina, it's the hydrostatic pressure from all the additional pelvic blood flow that forces fluid to leak out onto the surface as the vaginal lubrication. So how can we improve blood flow? Well, the flavonoid phytonutrients in cocoa can help open up arteries, increasing pulse wave amplitude from this at baseline to this after drinking cocoa for 4 days, peaking at about 90 minutes after consumption. So can that Valentine's Day chocolate make a difference? Women who eat chocolate do tend to have higher female sexual function index scores, but the effect disappeared once age was taken into account. So, despite all the potential biological mechanisms supporting a role for chocolate as an aphrodisiac food, the study failed to show a benefit. One would assume that chocolate could improve blood flow, but remember, that was with cocoa powder. Maybe the fat and sugar in chocolate is counteracting the benefits. What are some whole food sources of flavonoids? Well, onions have a lot, and indeed, fresh onion juice enhances copulatory behavior in rats. But for those of us less interested in increasing the percentage of ejaculating rats and looking for something other than onion juice for our hot date, How about that apple? But there wasn't a study addressing the potential correlation between daily apple consumption and women's sexual function until now. The title kind of gives it away, but women were split into regular daily apple consumers versus those consuming less than an apple a day. And the hundreds of apple eaters in the study scored significantly higher on the female sexual function index. Now, note they only included women eating unpeeled apples, because the phytonutrients are concentrated in the peel, so we don't know if there's a link with peeled apples. And this was just an observational study, and so further studies will be necessary to clarify the relationship between apple intake and female sexuality. However, the present data can allow the development of future research for identifying new compounds and food supplements to use in female sexuality recovery. Or you can just try eating an apple. Previously, I explored the use of spinach for athletic performance and recovery, attributed to its anti-inflammatory effects. But most athletes aren't using spinach to beat back inflammation. They use drugs, typically non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, used by up to 95% of collegiate athletes, and even three-quarters of kids playing high school football, including prophylactic use in an attempt to prevent pain and inflammation before it occurs. However, scientific evidence for this approach is currently lacking, and athletes should be aware of the potential risks, which include gastrointestinal pain and bleeding, kidney damage, liver damage. This is the study that freaked everyone out. A study of thousands of marathon runners, and 5 times the incidence of organ damage among those taking over-the-counter painkillers before the race. 9 were hospitalized, 3 kidney failure after taking ibuprofen, 4 with gastrointestinal bleeding after aspirin, and 2 heart attacks, whereas none of the control group not taking painkillers ended up in the hospital. And it looks like the drugs didn't even help. Analysis of the pain reported before and after the race showed no real advantage to taking the drugs, so it appeared to just be all downsides. What about using ginger instead? In that marathon study, the most common adverse effect of taking the drugs was gastrointestinal cramping. Ginger, in contrast to aspirin or ibuprofen-type drugs, may actually improve gastrointestinal function. For example, endurance athletes can suffer from nausea, and hey, ginger is prized for its anti-nausea properties. Yeah, but does it work for muscle pain? There's been at least 8 randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials of ginger for pain, everything from osteoarthritis to irritable bowel to painful periods. I've made videos about all those, as well as its use for migraine headaches. Overall, ginger extracts, like the powdered ginger spice you'd get at any grocery store, were found to be clinically effective pain-reducing agents with a better safety profile than the drugs. In some of the studies, the ginger worked better than in others, which is thought to be due in part to the different doses that were used. There's a strong dose-effect relationship. The best results in terms of reduction of pain were 1.5 to 2 grams a day, which is a full teaspoon of ground ginger. The drugs work by suppressing an enzyme in the body called cyclooxygenase 2, which triggers inflammation. The problem is that the drugs also suppress cyclooxygenase 1, which does good things, like protect the lining of your stomach and intestines. So since the inhibition of COX-1 is associated with gastrointestinal irritation, if only we could selectively inhibit the inflammatory one. That would offer kind of the best of both worlds, and that's what ginger seems to do. Here's the effect of 2 ginger compounds against cyclooxygenase 1, the good one. No effect, but can dramatically cut down on the pro-inflammatory one. OK, but does it work for muscle pain? Not acutely. You can't just take it like a drug. If you give folks a teaspoon of ginger before a bout of cycling, no difference in leg muscle pain over the 30 minutes. However, ginger may attenuate the day-to-day progression of muscle pain. Taking ginger 5 days in a row appears to accelerate the recovery of maximal strength following a high-load weightlifting protocol. Put all the studies together, and a single dose of ginger doesn't appear to help, but a teaspoon or two for a couple days or weeks in a pumpkin smoothie or something, and you may be able to reduce muscle pain and soreness and accelerate recovery of muscular strength. Is fresh ginger preferable to powdered? Maybe not. There's all sorts of compounds in ginger with creative names like gingerols and gingerdiols and gingerdiones, but the most potent anti-inflammatory component may be a compound called shogiol, and interestingly, dried ginger contains more than fresh, justifying the medicinal uses of powdered ginger for illnesses due to oxidative stress and inflammation. Why not then just give the extracted shogiol component in a pill by itself? Each of the active ginger components individually reduce inflammation, some more than others, but the whole ginger is greater than the sum of its parts. But you can boost shogiol concentration of whole ginger by drying it, as they're the major gingerol dehydration products. They're created when ginger is dried. Heating ginger may increase shogiol concentration even more, so could heated ginger work better against pain than raw? You don't know until you put it to the test. A study of 11 days of a teaspoon of raw ginger versus ginger that was boiled for 3 hours on muscle pain. A significant reduction in muscle soreness a day after pumping iron in the cooked ginger group, and the same benefit from the raw ginger. Either way, daily consumption of raw and heat-treated dried ginger can result in moderate to large reductions in muscle pain following exercise-induced muscle injury. Many, if not the majority of families with a child suffering from autism, pursue dietary and nutritional approaches as components of treatment. Estimates of the use of alternative therapies range from 28 to 95%, with special diets or dietary supplements the most frequently cited approach. Why so common? Perhaps parents are acting on suspicion or distrust of standard medical practices, or desire not to have their children drugged, considering alternative approaches more safe, natural, holistic, but could also simply be because the drugs don't work. Pharmacological interventions in autism are mainly aimed at reducing associated symptoms, calm them down, help them sleep, but have no effect on the core symptoms of ASD, autism spectrum disorders, like the social withdrawal, abnormal behaviors. Only 2 drugs have been approved for the treatment of autism, and both just target an associated symptom, irritability, rather than the core deficits of the disorder. Both drugs also have significant side effects, including weight gain and sedation. It's no surprise, then, that parents seek alternative therapies. OK, but do the alternatives work any better? In the alternative medicine literature, you'll see a lot of this kind of attitude. Evidence schmevidence. As long as the treatment isn't harmful, why not give it a try? Or even going further to suggest trying a treatment even if the evidence is stacked against it, because, hey, maybe your kid's the exception. I'm sympathetic to that thinking. Unfortunately, there are many unscrupulous charlatans out there, eager to take advantage of parents desperate to try anything that sounds like it might help. These researchers report receiving several emails a week from practitioners offering the cure for autism, often for the low price of $299, reporting to their horror at how these emails use guilt and guile to manipulate families. I mean, if you really loved your child, wouldn't you want to leave no stone unturned? When challenged, many such practitioners of these supposed cures will say things like, I know it works, I've seen it work, or I don't want to spend time and money testing it when I could be helping children right away. The researchers urge parents to run, not walk, away from any treatment that claims to be too good for science. All treatment should be subjected to the rigor of well-designed, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials. Our children deserve no less. Parents try them anyway, often without even telling their physicians, noting a perceived unwillingness among doctors to even consider potential benefits of alternatives. which I think arises because we've been burned so many times before. High-profile examples of ineffective or even dangerous complementary and alternative therapies have led to a general mistrust of and distaste for anything believed to be outside the box. Take the secretin story. Improved social and language skills, improved core autism symptoms after secretin administration. Secretin is a gut hormone involved in digestion. It's used in a diagnostic test for pancreatic function, so they were just doing this test on some children who just happened to have autism, and to their surprise, within weeks of administering the test, there was a dramatic improvement in the children's behavior. Improved eye contact, alertness, and language. Understandably, this sparked a media frenzy. Parents scrambled to find the stuff, leading to a black market for the drug. What makes an interesting television program may not, of course, be the same as what makes for good science. You've got to put it to the test. A randomized controlled trial on the effect of secretin on children with autism, and no significant effects were found. Though the study used porcine secretin, pig hormones, maybe human secretin would work better? And the answer is no, apparently not. Lack of benefit from human secretin too. But no, look at the data. Secretin totally worked. One shot of secretin and autism behaviors dropped within days. But the same thing happened, injecting nothing. Injecting saline, injecting water. That's why we do placebo-controlled studies. The widespread circulation of those anecdotal reports of the miraculous benefits of secretin may have raised expectations so much that it biased parents into perceiving improvement, explaining the effects of the placebo injection. In this way, ineffective treatments can become widely accepted even if there's no evidence to back them up, exemplified by the fact that most parents in the study still remained interested in secretin even after being told that it didn't work. They just couldn't give up hope. So the autism community continued to press. It's just got to work. In the end, 16 randomized, placebo-controlled trials were performed involving more than 900 children, and no evidence of benefit was found. None of the studies revealed significantly greater improvements in measures of language, cognition, or autistic symptoms when compared to pretending to give the kids drugs, but actually giving them nothing at all. In the absence of effective and affordable treatments for autism, parents of children with the disorder are extremely vulnerable to extravagant claims of potential cures. In the case of secretin, it was like a perfect storm of factors that propagated the myth, prompting a frenzy of secretin purchases by thousands of parents, often at hundreds or even thousands of dollars per dose. The secretin story shows why it's so important to subject proposed treatments to scientific scrutiny instead of just accepting anecdotal reports as proof. England has been keeping mortality statistics since 1665, when, yes, one person fell down some stairs and died, but in that week, nearly 4,000 people died of the plague. Today, the modern plague is heart disease, the #1 killer of men and women. But it wasn't always this way. If you dig back into those old statistics, by the middle of last century, heart disease was already killing off 5 to 10% of the population, but it was practically unknown at the beginning of the 20th century. Check out the natural history of coronary heart disease just in the 1920s and 30s, skyrocketing tenfold in men and the same in women. What was going on? A clue could be found if you split people up by socioeconomic class. You can tell this is a paper written about 1950 because it's split into males and wives. It was the richest folks who had up to triple the heart disease as the poorest. Maybe it had something to do with their rich diets? You don't know until you put it to the test, and in doing so, discover the natural cure of coronary heart disease, discovered decades ago by Pritikin, a plant-based diet and lifestyle program, followed by Dr. Dean Ornish, and then Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, But how many know of the name Hans Diehl? Dr. Diehl was the first director of research at the Pritikin Center back in 1976. He was inspired by the amazing results they were getting at the Pritikin Center, amazing results like that of a certain Grandmother Gregors. But he recognized the limitations of live-in residential programs, including their cost and the kind of artificial living environment that made sustaining the behaviors more difficult when patients returned back home. So Diehl developed the CHIP program as an affordable 30-day lifestyle intervention to be delivered in a community setting. 10 years in, Esselstyn encourages Hans to publish their results in the American Journal of Cardiology. And here it is. Coronary risk reduction through a community-based lifestyle intervention, famously starting out with a quote from the pioneer of coronary bypass surgery describing it as only a palliative treatment. The only way we're going to stop this epidemic is through prevention. We know vigorous cholesterol lowering can slow, arrest, or even reverse atherosclerosis, but it only works if you do it. Live-in programs work because you can control people's diets, but they're expensive, and people may go back home to toxic food environments. So how about instead of them coming to you, you go to them in the community? The original program was 16 evening sessions over 4 weeks, the major focus being to encourage participants to adopt the optimal diet. They also encourage people to walk a half hour a day, but most importantly, center your diet around whole plant foods. Now, that was the optimal, whole food, plant-based, but the program isn't dogmatic, just encouraging people to move along the spectrum towards incorporating more whole, healthy plant foods into their diets. They didn't provide meals, just advice and encouragement, and 4 weeks later got an average weight loss of about 6 pounds. Blood pressures went down about 6 points, and their LDL bad cholesterol down between 16 and 32 points, and fasting blood sugars dropped as well. Often, participants were able to decrease or discontinue anti-diabetic, cholesterol-lowering, and blood pressure-lowering medication, making their findings even more extraordinary, better numbers on fewer drugs. Live-in programs like Pritikin and McDougall are great in that you can optimize the clinical benefits, but they can cost thousands of dollars in addition to missing work, whereas CHIP is cheap, and they're living at home, so it's not like they've been spoon-fed some perfect diet for a few weeks at some spa and then go back to their cupboards of cookies. CHIP is a free living program, teaching people how to eat and stay healthy within their home environments. Well, at least that's the theory. And with these remarkable results were after just 4 weeks in the program. The true test will be to what extent people adhere to their new lifestyle and sustain their health benefits weeks, months, or even more than a year later. The CHIP program may be the most well-published community-based lifestyle intervention in the medical literature, and one of the most effective, with clinical changes approaching that achieved in live-in residential lifestyle programs. Encouraging people to transition towards a more whole food, plant-based diet achieved blood pressure benefits that were greater than those reported with the DASH diet and comparable with the results in blood pressure-lowering drug trials. If we're going to reverse the worldwide chronic disease epidemic, though, we've got to scale this thing up. So to make the CHIP program more accessible to a wider audience, each of Hans Diehl's live presentations were videotaped. Then you could just have a volunteer facilitator get people in a room, watch the videos, help foster discussion. When it comes to safe, simple, side effect-free solutions like a healthier diet and lifestyle, you don't need to wait for a doctor to show up and give a lecture. Yeah, but does it work? Look at these numbers for those that came in the worst of the worst and finished all the videos. 20-point drop in blood pressures, 40-point drop in LDL, more than a 500-point drop in triglycerides. Of those that came in with diabetic-level fasting blood sugars, about 1 in 3 left with non-diabetic fasting blood sugars, and all they did was empower people with knowledge. Just encouraging people to move toward a whole food, plant-based diet led to these remarkable benefits. How about the effectiveness of this volunteer-delivered lifestyle modification program on 5,000 people? Same kind of significant reductions in weight, blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, blood sugars. Most studies giving dietary advice to free-living subjects can be expected to reduce total cholesterol by only about 5%. But hey, a sustained reduction of even 1% may reduce in a 2 to 3% reduction in the incidence of heart disease. So, on a population scale, even small differences matter. But put thousands of people through just 1 month of CHIP and get an 11% drop on average, and up to a nearly 20% drop among those who need it the most. Yeah, but do they maintain their healthy habits? I mean, doctors can't even get most people to keep taking a single pill once a day. How effective is a volunteer-led video series going to be at getting people to maintain a change of eating habits? Researchers looked at the CHIP data to find out. How were participants still doing 18 months later? Most were able to maintain their reductions of meat, dairy, and eggs, though some of the junk food started to slip back in, and their fruit and veggie consumption dipped, though not back to baseline. But here's the huge shocker. Even though they were explicitly told to eat as much as they wanted, no calorie or carb counting, no portion control, just by being informed about the benefits of centering their diets more around whole plant foods, by the end of the 6-week program, they were eating, on average, about 339 fewer calories a day without even trying. Instead of eating less food, they were just eating healthier food. OK, but that was right at the end of the 6-week program, when they were all jazzed up. Where were they 18 months later? Anyone familiar with weight loss studies knows how this works. I mean, you can excite anyone in the short term to lose weight using practically any kind of diet, but then 6 months later, a year later, they tend to gain it all back, or even more. Yeah, they were eating about 300 calories less a day during the program, but 18 months later, we're only eating about 400 calories less? Well, wait, what kind of diet can work even better the longer you do it? A whole food, plant-based diet. Many weight loss programs restrict calorie intake by limiting portion sizes, which often results in hunger and dissatisfaction, contributing to low compliance and weight regain. But the satiety-promoting, all-you-care-to-eat, plant-based whole food dietary approach may be the secret weapon towards sustainable weight loss. The best-kept secret in medicine is that, given the right conditions, the body can sometimes heal itself. And when it comes to cardiovascular disease, there's no substitute for nutritional excellence. So, Ornish, Pritikin, Barnard, Esselstyn, all the great names in evidence-based nutrition. But how many have heard about the CHIP program, the Coronary Health Improvement Project, a volunteer-run community-based education program, educating physicians and patients alike about the power of nutrition as medicine, as perhaps the best investment we can make in the fight against heart disease. More effective, cheaper, safer, and what are the side effects? Improved overall health, and not just physical health. Lifestyle change programs such as CHIP, aimed at improving physical health behaviors, can likewise have a profound effect on mental health. Based on studies of thousands of individuals who went through the CHIP program, there were significant improvements in a number of sleep or stress disorders like sleeping restlessly or not sleeping at all, stress, upset, fear, depression. Here are the numbers. Most of these cut in half, all highly significant findings. The question is why? Well, the psychological well-being of the CHIP participants might have been positively affected by increasing feelings of empowerment, and making strides towards reducing their body weight, improving other health indicators. As they start eating better and making strides, feelings of despair and failure may be replaced by a growing sense of accomplishment, increased social support, a new sense of hope. Or they may just be physically feeling better. I mean, if your diabetes goes away, that's reason enough to perk you up. While these before and after results look great, what was missing? Right, a control group. Now you say, wait, they each acted as their own control, before and after. But you're forgetting about the Hawthorne effect. Remember, just being in a study under observation can affect people's behavior. So, if they put you on a scale, weigh you, and say they're going to weigh you again in 6 months, people may consciously or unconsciously just eat better on their own, even if they're not told to do anything special. So how much of these improvements would have happened without the CHIP program? Yeah, it's great that you can take 1,000 people and markedly reduce their risk factor profiles for our leading killer in just 4 weeks, regardless. But to know exactly what role healthy eating and living advice can play, you need to put it to the test by performing randomized controlled trials. And as expected, there were small improvements even in the control group. But for almost all variables, the CHIP intervention group showed significantly greater improvements, so much so as to have the potential to dramatically reduce the risks associated with common chronic diseases in the long term. Ironically, CHIP was so successful in the city of Rockford, Illinois, that dozens of restaurants started offering special plant-based menu options, so the control group might have been sneaking in some healthier meals, too. OK, but what about the mental health improvements? A randomized controlled trial and those in the CHIP group showed significantly greater improvements in physical functioning, pain, general health perceptions, vitality, social functioning, emotional, and mental health. For example, significant improvements in particularly mild to moderate depression compared to the control group. And not just right after the program ended, but 6 months later. So, the CHIP acronym started out as the Coronary Health Improvement Project, but as study after study showed the efficacy of the intervention in addressing other chronic diseases, such as type 2 diabetes and even depression, it has since been renamed the Complete Health Improvement Program. As Hans Diehl, the founder of CHIP, explains it, we as a society are largely at the mercy of powerful and manipulative marketing forces that basically tell us what to eat. Everywhere we look, we're being seduced to the good life, as marketers define it. But this so-called good life has produced in this country an avalanche of morbidity and mortality, disease and death. What he'd like to see in America is not this so-called good life, but the best life, a simpler lifestyle, characterized by eating more whole plant foods. In other words, foods as grown. How do you wipe out the nation's heart disease epidemic? According to the Center for Science in the Public Interest, one of the best approaches for preventing the disease in the first place is the CHIP program, which tells people to eat more whole plant foods and less meat, dairy, eggs, and processed junk. It's considered to be a premier lifestyle intervention targeting chronic disease that has been offered for more than 25 years, through which more than 50,000 individuals have gone, and most CHIP classes are run by volunteers, sourced primarily through the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who had an interest in positively influencing the health of their local community. Why the Adventists? Well, they have a health philosophy built around a biblical notion that the human body should be treated as a temple, and many of the participants of the program are Adventists too. Is that why the program works so well? Because they just have faith? You don't know until you put it to the test. The influence of religious affiliation on responsiveness to the Complete Health Improvement Program. They looked at 7,000 participants. Even though Adventists make up less than 1% of the U.S. population, about 1 in 5 CHIP-goers were in the church. How did they do compared to the non-believers? Substantial reductions in selected risk factors were achieved for both Adventists and non-Adventists, but some of the reductions were actually greater among the non-Adventists, non-SDA. This indicates that Seventh-day Adventists do not have a monopoly on good health. Middle-class, educated individuals also disproportionately make up CHIP classes. Would it work as well in poverty-stricken populations? We didn't know until now. How about trying to reduce chronic disease risk factors among individuals living in rural Appalachia, one of the poorest parts of the country? Conventional wisdom has been that you need to have some financial skin in the game to really commit to lifestyle change programs, and so if offered for free to impoverished communities, maybe the results wouldn't be as good. But the overall clinical changes were similar to those found in other 4-week CHIP classes throughout the U.S., suggesting CHIP may benefit across socioeconomic lines and independent of payment source. So hey, why don't employers offer it free to employees to save on healthcare costs? CHIP is described as achieving some of the most impressive outcomes published in the medical literature, clinical benefits and cost-effectiveness as well. Lee Memorial, a healthcare network in Florida, offered it to some of their employees as a pilot program. Sadly, healthcare workers can be as unhealthy as everyone else. They report an average 17-pound weight loss, 20-point drop in LDL cholesterol, and blood pressure normalization in most participants. They invested about $38,000 to make the program happen, but then saved just in that next year $70,000 in reduced healthcare costs, because they became so much healthier, for a financial return on investment of like 1.8 times what they put in. But there hasn't been an ROI study published in the peer-reviewed medical literature until Dexter Sherney stepped up to the plate and published this workplace study out of Vanderbilt. Now, there was a high degree of skepticism at the planning stage of the study that active engagement could be realized around a lifestyle program that had as main tenets exercise and a plant-based diet. Vanderbilt is, after all, in Tennessee, smack dab in the middle of the stroke belt, known for their Memphis ribs. Yet they got on board enough to improve their blood sugar control and cholesterol, as well as positive changes in self-reported health and well-being. Healthcare costs were substantially reduced. For example, nearly a quarter were able to eliminate one or more of their medications, and so got about a 2-to-1 return on investment within just 6 months, providing evidence that just educating a member population about the benefit of a plant-based whole foods diet is feasible and can reduce healthcare costs. The largest workplace CHIP study done to date involved 6 employee populations, including, ironically, a drug company, a mix of white-collar and blue-collar, and check out what happened to the worse off. Those starting out with blood pressures up around 170 over 100 fell down to around 140 over 85. Those with the highest LDL cholesterol dropped 60 points, a 300-point drop in triglycerides, 46-point drop in fasting blood sugars. Theoretically, someone coming in with both high blood pressure and high cholesterol might experience a 64 to 96% reduction in overall risk of a heart attack, our #1 killer. For the cost of a Humvee, Michael Jacobson from CSPI figured any town could have a CHIP program of its own. And for the cost of a submarine or a farm subsidy, the entire country could get a chip on its shoulder. If you compared the total antioxidant content of 10 different legumes, which do you think would come out on top? Pinto beans, lima beans, red kidney beans, black kidney beans, for which I think they just mean black beans, navy beans, small red beans, black-eyed peas, mung beans, lentils, versus chickpeas. Who can guess the winner and the loser? Quick, pause the video. Coming in at number 10, bottom of the barrel, lima beans, then navy beans, both pretty sad, then black-eyed peas, then mung beans, which is what they typically make bean sprouts out of. Then moving into the winner's circle, kidney beans. I bet there were some of you that guessed that that would be our #1, but no, they're just middle of the pack. There are 5 better. Want to pause again and reconsider? Next, pinto beans, then black beans, and the bronze to small red beans. And who do you think got the gold? Anyone want to take any bets? Lentil soup or hummus? What do you think? And it's lentils for the win. You can see how lentils pull away from the pack in terms of scavenging up free radicals. Lentils top the charts based on a variety of different measures, maybe because they're so small and the nutrients are concentrated in the seed coat, and so smaller means more surface area. That'd be my guess. When pitted against cholesterol in vitro to try to prevent oxidation, lentils also seem to stand out, perhaps making it the best candidate for the development of a dietary supplement for promoting heart health and for preventing cancers. Or you could just have some lentil soup. I just throw them in my pressure cooker with oat groats when I make oatmeal. Aside from lentils, black beans, black soybeans, and red kidney beans also seem to top the list. Here's the breakfast. Now, if you also serve a bowl of black bean soup, or just the amount of fiber in that bowl of soup, or just the amount of antioxidants found in that bowl of soup, which do you think works better? Whole plant foods can be greater than just the sum of their parts. Nowadays, it's popular to isolate and sell functional components of foods as dietary supplements. However, the extracted ingredients may not produce the same effects when delivered outside of a whole food form. In this study, for example, they compared the ability of black beans to attenuate after-meal metabolic, oxidative stress, and inflammatory responses to a crappy breakfast, and determined the relative contributions of dietary fiber and antioxidant capacity to the overall effect. Well, it's kind of a no-brainer. The results of the whole black beans in a meal improve metabolic responses that could not be explained by either the fiber or antioxidant fractions alone. Beans can even affect our responses to subsequent meals. When our body detects starch in our small intestine, it slows down the rate at which our stomach empties. That makes sense. The body wants to finish digesting before the next meal comes down the pike. And so, might eating a slowly digesting starch, such as lentils, trigger these potent mechanisms to result in a sustained delaying effect on stomach emptying. Here's the stomach emptying rate at a second meal, 4.5 hours later after you eat a quickly digesting starch like bread. This is not how fast you're emptying the bread. This is how fast your stomach is emptying a second meal hours later after you ate the bread. But what about the same meal eaten 4.5 hours after eating lentils? Significantly slower, like up to an hour slower, which means you would feel that much fuller that much longer after lunch because you had some beans for breakfast. Then when all the fiber and resistant starch make it down to our large intestine, they can feed the good bacteria in our colon. Researchers fed people a little over a cup of canned chickpeas a day, and in just 3 weeks, some of the bad bacteria, the pathogenic and putrefaction bacteria, got crowded out, cutting the number of people colonizing a high ammonia-producing bacteria nearly in half, indicating that chickpeas have the potential to modulate our intestinal microbiome to promote intestinal health within a matter of weeks. When you search the medical literature for studies on berries, papers like this pop up: a blueberry muffin rash, or pictures of strawberry tongues, or as a way to describe stool appearance, though stools truly resembling currant jelly are not very common. What is it with pathologists' love affair with food terminology, the grossest of which may be the way amoeba chest infections are described, where you spit up pus that looks like anchovy sauce, which sounds gross even without the pus. There are actual studies on berry supplementation, like on how they can mitigate the negative effects of a high saturated fat diet on the brain and behavior, but that was in mice. Maybe a better way to mitigate would be to not feed your pet mouse a stick of butter in the first place. Then there are studies on proprietary berry-based nutraceutical supplements, purported to improve cognitive performance. See how there's a steeper rise in the supplement group? Old hats will instantly recognize this as the timeless trick featured in the 1950s classic, How to Lie with Statistics. See how they don't start the y-axis at 0? That's to inflate the appearance. Correct the graph, and you can see the effect doesn't quite look so impressive. There are studies of actual berries on actual humans, but when they're funded by berry industry trade groups, you get studies like this. An afternoon snack of berries reduces subsequent energy intake. Great, but that's compared to candy. Strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, fantastic, compared to a handful of jelly babies, which are just like coated gummy bears. Do berries offer so little that you have to compare them to candy to make them look good? There was that famous Harvard study I did a video about, where berry eating appeared to delay brain aging by up to 2.5 years, but you don't know if it's cause and effect until you put it to the test. and blueberry supplementation was able to improve memory in older adults in just 12 weeks' time. But that was feeding them up to 6 cups of wild blueberries a day. Now, this was a proof-of-concept pilot study just to see if they get any effect, right? We just didn't have any studies using more realistic doses until now. How about just a cup a day of blueberries? They found that the addition of easily achievable quantities of blueberries to the diets of older adults can improve some aspects of cognition, like long-term memory. In terms of the number of errors, the placebo group got worse, the blueberry group got better. You can even correlate the cognitive improvements with enhanced brain activation, using fancy brain scan technology to actually visualize the improved blood flow to those same regions of the brain caused by the blueberry consumption. Does it work in kids too? Blueberry treatments have shown positive effects on cognition in both rats and adult humans. But do these benefits transfer to children, human children? How about a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study comparing about a cup of blueberries to 2 cups to 0 cups? What did they find? Cognitive performance improvements across all measures, and the more berries, the better. And this wasn't after 12 weeks of eating berries, but within hours of just a single blueberry meal. Sounds like a good breakfast any day our kids are having their exams. In response to a photo showing a woman taping a cabbage leaf onto her knee to help with her osteoarthritis, doctors wrote in asserting that cabbage leaves can help inflammation of any body part. You may even find that there's a cache of cabbage in the fridge of your local maternity unit. Why? Well, not only is cabbage cheaper than gel packs, but knees are not the only anatomical shapes that the leaves conform well to. Breast engorgement, when the breasts become overfilled with milk during breastfeeding, becoming hard, tight, and painful, can negatively impact both mother and infant alike. So, why not put cabbage leaves on them? A lactation consultant in a breastfeeding journal suggests wearing cabbage leaves. Evidently works like a charm, and once the swelling goes down, frequent breastfeeding should help them from refilling up too much. Where did she even get the idea for this? Well, her son got in a car accident, she wrapped his leg in cabbage, and the rest is history. The only adverse side effect identified was a complaint from the son who felt like a vegetable. Based on the information she collected, she concluded that cool green cabbage compresses have anti-inflammatory, anti-edema, anti-swelling, and anti-infectious properties, but you don't really know until you put it to the test. Yeah, but who's going to do a randomized controlled study of cabbage leaves? Scientists, that's who. Do cabbage leaves prevent breast engorgement? Let's find out. 120 women randomized to apply cabbage leaves to their breasts or not, and though the cabbage group tended to report less breast engorgement, the trend was not statistically significant, though one of the big things you care about is premature weaning, and the cabbage group did seem to be able to extend the time they were exclusively breastfeeding. So while they couldn't rule out the possibility that cabbage leaves had a direct effect on breast engorgement that may have contributed to the increased breastfeeding success in the experimental group, they consider the positive effect to be more likely due to psychological mechanisms. In other words, the placebo effect. They did weed out some of the true believers, though, as some women refused to join the study out of fear they might end up in the control group and not be able to use them. A similar study, performed recently, found that while adding cabbage leaves to early breast care didn't significantly reduce pain, it did seem to significantly reduce breast hardness. Since it probably can't hurt, some women might want to just give it a try. But it would be nice to get some more concrete answers, like how about a treatment trial instead of just prevention? You could try hot cabbage leaves versus cold cabbage leaves. To control for the placebo effect, you could use placebo cabbage, like iceberg lettuce leaves or something. In fact, since both breasts are affected, women could act as their own controls, with cabbage on one breast and turning over a new leaf on the other. How about a comparison of chilled cabbage leaves versus chilled gel packs? Just cold alone decreases blood flow, might therefore decrease engorgement. On the other hand, maybe cabbage leaves contain some component that the mother's skin absorbs that somehow helps. You don't know until you put it to the test. 34 lactating women with breast engorgement. One breast got the cabbage, one breast got the gel pack. Their pain levels were established before and after, and there was no difference. They both appeared to work about just as well, with 2/3 reporting relief within hours either way. Though interestingly, the majority of mothers preferred the cabbage leaves. The similarity in the effect may have been caused by the fact that both applied cold, although you'd think the effects of the cold of the cabbage leaves would have been transitory. So hey, maybe there is something special in cabbage leaves after all. What you'd have to do is like a comparison of chilled versus room temperature cabbage. OK, here you go. One breast gets the chilled cabbage leaf, and the other gets a room temperature cabbage leaf, and there was no difference between the two. They both seem to work, suggesting that it's not the cold itself that's doing it, but we still don't know what the role the placebo effect is playing. If you were going to design a study to determine if there was some special compound in cabbage that could decrease breast engorgement, what would you do? You could try the iceberg lettuce, but if women heard about the cabbage effect, they might have an expectation bias in favor of the cabbage. Aha! How about using a cabbage leaf extract? Then you can finally do a double-blind experiment where women don't know which breasts are exposed to the cabbage by asking them to rub on a cream containing a cabbage leaf extract versus a placebo cream. They added rose water to both creams to try to camouflage any residual cabbage odor, and no difference in relief. Now, the decrease in discomfort produced by the cream was not as strong as that produced by the real cabbage leaves in the previous studies. The superiority of the whole leaves might be explained by a failure of the extract to contain the potentially active chemical, or maybe the chemical broke down, or maybe it wasn't concentrated enough, or maybe there was just a powerful placebo effect of wearing cabbage leaves. The bottom line is that even though no active pharmacological substances in cabbage leaves have been identified, the convenient shape of cabbage leaves, their low cost, wide availability, and purported soothing effect make it a sought-after treatment. There is unequivocal evidence that habitual or regular marijuana smoking is not harmless and causes respiratory symptoms and airway inflammation. If you take biopsies from the airways of those who smoke crack, cannabis, or tobacco, compared to non-smokers, there was significantly more damage in the lungs of crack smokers, marijuana smokers, and tobacco smokers. And the levels of damage seems comparable, especially between the marijuana smokers and tobacco smokers, which is remarkable since the tobacco smokers were smoking about a pack a day, whereas the marijuana smokers were only smoking about 20 joints a week, rather than 25 cigarettes a day, and those smoking crack were just doing like a gram or two a week. So to see similar rates of damage between marijuana smokers and cigarette smokers suggests each joint is way worse than each cigarette. And indeed, we've known for 30 years that smoking 3 or 4 joints is the equivalent of smoking a pack a day of cigarettes in terms of bronchitis symptoms and acute lung damage. How is that possible? Well, maybe the way they're smoked. Pot smokers inhale more deeply and then hold the smoke in 4 times longer, resulting in more tar deposition in the lungs. And joints are more loosely packed and unfiltered, resulting in both hotter smoke and smokier smoke. And so even though in many ways smoke is smoke, the different method of smoking may explain how a few joints a day appear to cause as much inflammation as an entire pack a day of cigarettes. The visual evidence of airway injury was at times striking. This is what your airways are supposed to look like. The tubes inside your lungs. This is your lung. This is your lung on tobacco. See how your airways get all inflamed? And this is your lung on pot. You get the same kind of inflammation. And what's crazy is that's just 5 joints a day compared to 26 cigarettes a day in the tobacco smokers. If you compare the respiratory symptoms associated with marijuana versus tobacco, compared to non-smokers, both marijuana smokers and tobacco smokers have elevated rates of chronic cough and excess sputum production, acute episodes of bronchitis, and wheezing. Now, when you quit tobacco, these respiratory symptoms eventually go away. Does the same thing happen with marijuana? What are the effects of quitting cannabis on respiratory symptoms? About 30 to 40% of regular cannabis users suffer from cough, excess sputum, wheezing, and shortness of breath. 1,000 young adults were followed for years, and those who kept smoking, their respiratory symptoms got worse or remained the same, but those that quit tended to get better. If we don't quit, what are the long-term lung consequences? What about COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases like emphysema? Even if smoking a single joint compromises lung function as much as up to 5 cigarettes, you're still smoking 15 times less overall, and so should end up with less long-term lung damage, right? That's indeed what's been found. Even long-term pot smokers don't appear to suffer lasting lung damage. Follow people for 20 years, an occasional joint appears to have no discernible effect on long-term lung function, though maybe some accelerated decline in function among those smoking joints every day for decades, and so marijuana moderation is suggested. In other words, a caution against regular heavy marijuana usage is prudent, but even regular heavy use of marijuana is nothing compared with the grave pulmonary consequences of tobacco. Any toxicity of marijuana pales when compared with the greatest legalized killer in the world today. In fact, the greatest risk to our lungs from marijuana may be that it can be a gateway drug to cigarettes. There are many ways people inhale marijuana. Most people smoke it, either in a bowl, pipe, joint, or bong. This is concerning, since in many ways smoke is smoke, and using a bong doesn't help in terms of the tar exposure. Where there's fire, there's smoke, and where there's smoke, there's inflammatory irritants. In fact, the regular smoking of cannabis is associated with the kind of airway inflammation you see in the lungs of cigarette smokers, which can result in prolonged respiratory symptoms such as chronic coughing, excess sputum production, wheezing, and shortness of breath, as well as an increased incidence of bronchitis and other respiratory infections. In many ways, smoke is smoke, whether it's from burning plants in a forest fire or burning plants in a joint or cigarette. There are harmful byproducts of combustion, any combustion, like carbon monoxide. In fact, you get 5 times more carbon monoxide per puff in cannabis than tobacco, since pot smokers inhale more deeply and then hold the smoke in. Now, you can avoid that completely by eating cannabis instead, but the slow, erratic drug absorption doesn't give the same kind of immediate high. Inhaling cannabis vapor, however, could potentially offer the best of both worlds, giving the same kind of high in terms of subjective ratings compared to smoking it, but with significantly less carbon monoxide exposure. So similar effects with fewer toxic byproducts, though not necessarily all toxic byproducts. Both cannabis smoke and just vapor can evidently contain high concentrations of ammonia, and sometimes vapor can be even worse. So yeah, vapor has less tar, but may have more ammonia. This was with a direct heat vaporizer, the so-called Blue Meanie. Using a hot air vaporizer like the Volcano brand results in ammonia levels in your bloodstream more comparable to smoking it. But the only reason we care about contaminants is we're trying to cut down on the inflammation. Does cannabis vapor produce fewer respiratory symptoms than smoke? According to this study, the first of its kind, yes. Now, vaporizing doesn't help with dependence issues or impaired driving or brain damage among heavy adolescent users, but may improve cannabis drug safety by minimizing lung troubles. They conclude that regular users of joints, blunts, pipes, and water pipes might decrease respiratory symptoms by switching to a vaporizer. But this was just based on a snapshot-in-time internet survey asking people about their symptoms. You don't know for sure until you put it to the test. In a study funded by a pro-legalization group, they recognized that respiratory symptoms are a stumbling block in their efforts, so suggest inhaling cannabis vapor rather than smoke might minimize respiratory complaints. So they had 20 frequent cannabis smokers with respiratory symptoms switch over to using a vaporizer instead for a month, and those that didn't happen to fall ill with respiratory illness during that period experienced a significant improvement in their respiratory symptoms. But wait a second, 8 out of 20? 40% got a respiratory illness within a single month? That doesn't sound good. And indeed, it's something they noted. Additionally, the self-reported improvements may have been tinged with bias, as smokers might think such results might be good for the cause. This may have backfired, though, as there are calls in the medical literature to just legalize smokeless forms, or at least set it up so that smoked marijuana is more heavily taxed or something. During the past decade, a wide range of symptoms have been reportedly triggered by exposure to the radio frequency electromagnetic fields that emanate from cell phones during use, including headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue. The news media has promoting this as a new medical condition called electrosensitivity or electromagnetic hypersensitivity. These stories have been driven in part by people who claim to have detected a clear link between their own poor health and exposure to a specific electrical device, which can have major implications for a person's quality of life and health and stress, not to mention problems at the job or social situations. To see how common this was, they sat college students down on 2 big electromagnetic coils, and then went through a symptom checklist asking how they felt under both strong and weak electromagnetic field conditions. And they did report neurological symptoms, headaches, drowsiness, dizziness, fatigue, and irritability, visceral symptoms such as palpitations, muscle tension, nausea, though more under the weak field condition, abdominal pain, shortness of breath, and a little heartburn. They could feel it in their skin, crawly, cold, sweaty, itchy feelings, and their sensory organs registered blurred vision, ringing in their ears, dry mouth, a little stuffy, along with some other symptoms. 40 students in all asked to rate the symptoms during the sham, weak, and strong exposures, but in reality, it was all a sham. They weren't blasted with any fields, period. The coils seemed to be connected to an impressive electric power supply with colored lights and everything, but it wasn't even really connected to anything under any of the conditions. The study was titled Polluted Places or Polluted Minds, suggesting that those who claim to be experiencing these symptoms may just be deluding themselves. Before jumping to conclusions, though, you want to study people who actually suffer from the disorder. 20 men and women who claimed they were sensitive to cell phones were put to the test. They reported a variety of symptoms upon exposure to cell phone radiation, all sorts of pains and sensations, dizziness, breathing difficulties. So, researchers sat them down in a chair with various active cell phones strapped near their head, and boy could they feel them, experiencing a variety of symptoms, but, ironically, they felt a bit worse with just like a beanbag dummy phone next to their head. Contrary to definite expectations, none of the so-called electrosensitive could even distinguish whether the cell phones were turned on or off. And that's what nearly all such studies have found: no evidence that the symptoms are anything but psychological in nature, noting that those who claim such hypersensitivity tend to exhibit more obsessive-compulsive, hostile, phobic, paranoid traits, and so they changed the name. What used to be called electromagnetic hypersensitivity in the medical literature is now called idiopathic environmental intolerance attributed to electromagnetic fields, an acronym that sounds like something straight out of Old MacDonald's farm. Despite the conviction of IEMF sufferers that their symptoms are triggered by exposure to magnetic fields, repeated experiments have been unable to replicate this phenomenon under controlled conditions. And we're talking 46 studies involving more than 1,000 people who say they have it, but when put to the test, when you put all the studies together, not only did they find no significant impact on any of the symptoms, there was no evidence the subjects were even able to detect the fields. Not a single person ever? Well, there was this one study in which 2 participants showed extraordinary performance, guessing when the cell phone was on up to 97 times out of 100. I mean, if that was just chance, that would be like the odds of being struck by lightning 4 times in a single year. But they failed to replicate the result a month later. And in science, if you can't replicate something, it doesn't exist. So why does this notion of hypersensitivity persist? Well, there is now an entire industry profiting off various gizmos claiming to protect people, and the media seems to love the hypersensitivity story. Yet why don't journalists mention the data? The media has tended to claim research in this area has been neglected, but the research has been done. Dozens of studies that appear to have been systematically ignored by almost every single journalist covering the issue. Blind provocation studies published in the peer-reviewed academic literature, and they're almost all negative. I mean, you could argue the evidence is nearly unanimous. So why doesn't the media even mention the data? Perhaps they leave it out on purpose. Perhaps they're just incompetent and never looked it up. Or maybe they're just suckered in by the snake oil salesman selling insulating paint and protective beekeeper hats. Not only do these lobbyists also conveniently fail to mention the dozens of studies, they viciously attack anyone who even dares to mention the data, accusing them of denying the reality of people's symptoms. No one's saying they're making them up. The science just suggests whatever the symptoms, the cell phones don't appear to be the cause. And hey, look, if you want to go there, one could just as fairly argue that those who are trying to sell these poor people a bill of goods are themselves hindering better understanding of their customers' suffering. In 2017, a study of more than 1,000 food poisoning outbreaks determined that poultry, specifically chicken, was the most common culprit, highlighting the role of poultry as a major source of foodborne outbreaks in the United States. Fish was second, beef was third, but aren't people more likely to order their burgers rarer than their chicken sandwich? See, the biggest problem isn't the cooking, but the handling, both at home and in the store. A shop-along study was conducted to determine actual shopping behavior of consumers who purchased raw poultry products. What did they find? Neither hand sanitizer or wipes were observed in 71% of grocery store meat sections of the stores visited, and even when they were there, only 1 participant out of the 96 they followed used it. Therefore, it's important to educate shoppers on the importance of using hand sanitizer in the meat section after touching poultry packages, because food poisoning bacteria can get on the outside of the package. Plastic bags were available in most meat sections, but only a quarter of the shoppers used the bags for their raw poultry purchases. The shoppers just usually placed the poultry directly in the main basket of the grocery cart, where it could come in contact with fresh produce that may be eaten raw in a salad or something. And then, where does their hand go? They didn't use any kind of sanitizer, and they then just grabbed the handle of the cart. Because they're not practicing good hand hygiene when handling poultry in the grocery store meat section, they could contaminate a variety of items as a result of contact with their hands. Touching the cart after directly handling the poultry packages could potentially mean that the cart becomes a risk factor for Salmonella or Campylobacter for the next person. The bacteria potentially left on the cart could affect other shoppers, not just the person picking up the poultry. So some kale shopper, following all the safety precautions, can come along and still be exposed to poultry contamination via the cart. In addition to touching the cart, poultry shoppers may also touch a personal item after touching a raw poultry package, a personal item like their children. After touching poultry packages, 31% of shoppers touched a personal item like their purse, their child. Most left the store with poultry separated in its own bag. However, most consumers then took it out of this protective layer when they got home, and 1 in 3 placed the package directly on the counter before it went into the fridge. And most were just put straight in, where it could potentially come in contact with other items. Fewer than 1 in 5 consumers correctly stored raw poultry on the bottom shelf in a sealed container or plastic bag. Always in the bottom, since if the raw juices leak, they could contaminate other foods. The next mistake most people make is then washing or rinsing raw poultry before cooking it. Up to 90% of people say they wash their chicken before cooking it, because that's what they're used to, and they want to rinse the slime off. The problem is that the slime can be splashed throughout like a 2-foot halo of contamination around the sink. A lot of folks heard you weren't supposed to do that, but they continue to do it anyway. Fewer than about 1 in 10 thaw frozen poultry the way they should in a sealed container or plastic bag, submerged in cold water, with the water changed every 30 minutes. Is it better to put raw poultry on a wood cutting board or a plastic cutting board? Neither is safe, as they both get rapidly contaminated. Failure to then use a food thermometer is another potentially unsafe practice, given that 70% of chicken pieces that were judged by consumers as done had not reached safe internal cooking temperatures. In focus groups, many participants thought food thermometers were unnecessary to determine whether meat and poultry was cooked thoroughly, because look, they've been cooking for years without once getting food poisoning. But had they ever got a 24-hour flu? There's no such thing as a 24-hour flu. That's likely food poisoning. Stomach flu or stomach bug, that's likely food poisoning. Ever had a urinary tract infection? There are multiple lines of evidence indicating poultry as a major food animal reservoir for urinary tract infection bacteria that lay in wait in the rectum and then crawl up. There are more than 1 million foodborne Salmonella and Campylobacter infections every year in the United States. Although half of Americans think it's not very common for people in the United States to get foodborne illness because of the way food is prepared in their home, food safety experts estimate that the home is the primary location where foodborne disease outbreaks occur. In a video I did a decade ago, you can tell how ancient it is by these silly graphics, I explained that the cholesterol-raising factor in coffee does not pass through a drip coffee paper filter. Give people French press coffee, which is filtered but without paper, and their cholesterol swells up over time, starting within just 2 weeks. But switch them to paper-filtered coffee, and their cholesterol comes right back down. Same amount of coffee, but just prepared differently. The cholesterol-raising factor from coffee beans has since been identified. It's the fatty substances in the oil within coffee beans. One reason it took us so long to figure that out is that it didn't raise cholesterol in rats, or hamsters, or even monkeys, but it did in human beings. But it apparently gets stuck in the paper filter. This explains why filtered coffee doesn't affect cholesterol, whereas boiled, or French press, or Turkish coffees do. Espresso as well, which has 20 times more of the cholesterol-raising substance cafestol than paper-filtered drip coffee, with Turkish and boiled coffee being the worst, though instant and percolator coffee are pretty low even without the paper filter. Note if you make drip coffee with one of those metal mesh filters without the paper, it would presumably be just as bad as like French press. So the studies in general appeared to consistently find that it was this fatty component that was then filtered out by paper. But a small number of studies suggested that filtered coffee may also increase cholesterol levels, and began to cast some doubt into what appeared to be a fairly clear picture. So yeah, the cholesterol-raising effects brought about by the consumption of filtered coffee may not be as strong as that of boiled coffee. Maybe we shouldn't discard the possibility that filtered coffee may also play a small but important role in raising cholesterol. I knew about this study, where 3 cups a day of filtered coffee raised total cholesterol, but the rise in LDL bad cholesterol was not statistically significant. Same with this study, where stopping filtered coffee reduced total cholesterol, suggesting perhaps only partial removal. But no one had ever just measured the levels of the cholesterol-raising compounds in the paper filters until now. The results showed that most of the cholesterol-raising cafestol was retained by the coffee grounds, rather than actually getting stuck in the filter itself. In other words, the principal function of the paper filter is not necessarily to block the compound itself, but to block any fine particles that are carrying the compound. Like when you make French press coffee, there's that fine mesh screen, but you still notice a little sludge at the bottom of the cup. That's the tiny particles that pass through and can carry some of the risk. But a little cafestol does get through the filter, so yeah, you can cut out more than 90% switching from French press or one of the metal mesh filters by using a paper filter. If you use coffee that starts out with a high level of the cafestol compound, you're still clearing out about 95% with a paper, but there may be enough left to still bump your LDL. But you don't know until you put it to the test. They started out with a high cafestol coffee. After a month of drinking 2 cups a day, their LDL cholesterol went up significantly, even though it was paper filtered. So if you have high cholesterol, despite eating a healthy diet, you may want to try cutting out coffee and getting retested. Or you can try switching to a lower cafestol coffee. There's all sorts of variables, such as roasting degree or grind size, that may affect cafestol levels. One can imagine a smaller particle size would allow for greater extraction. Roasting appears to destroy some of it, so really dark roast should have less. But there's not much difference between just like light and medium roast. And indeed, in this study, there was no significant difference between the rise in cholesterol after a medium light roast versus a medium roast. They both raised bad cholesterol. Jet lag is a blessing to circadian biologists, because the disruption of mental and physical well-being immediately highlights the importance of their work, the study of our internal body clock. Much of the general malaise we may experience on long journeys may just be so-called travel fatigue, which can occur regardless of the time zone, leaving people feeling disoriented, generally weary, headachy. Dehydration has been blamed. The air circulating in the cabins of commercial airlines is pretty dry. Yeah, it can make your throat, skin, and eyes feel dry. But if you do the math, the maximum loss of fluid through breath and sweat wouldn't be more than an extra half cup. So it's not like you're in Death Valley or something. And that calculation assumes that the passenger would be nude, and I'm sure they'd charge extra for that. Of course, giving people salty pretzels doesn't help. The vegetarian option tends to be healthier if they're serving meals, but you have to specify that when you book. BYOF, bring your own fruit, is a good rule to fly by, or unsalted nuts as a snack. The cabin air isn't just dry, but low in oxygen pressure, about what you'd get 10,000 feet above sea level, like twice as high as Denver, and that alone can make you feel not so great. Then when you land, if you've crossed enough time zones, you can suffer from jet lag, which is the temporary disconnect between the new time at your destination and that of your own internal body clock, which is still on home time. This is abnormal, since our internal clock is normally synced to the outside world. But the symptoms of jet lag go away as our body becomes hip to the new time. This usually takes, in days, 2/3 the number of time zones crossed eastwards, compared with half the number of time zones crossed westwards. So London is 6 time zones east away from Chicago, so flying there it may take 4 days before you're back to normal, whereas Londoners flying to Chicago should get over their jet lag in only 3 days. The reason it's easier to go west, where the day is longer, than east, is because our internal clock is naturally set for longer than 24 hours, and has to be reset every day. That's why they call the daily rhythm circadian, meaning about a day. In fact, you can see this in Major League Baseball performance. Researchers churned through 40,000 games, mining 20 seasons, and found surprisingly specific results of circadian misalignment, jet lag. And indeed, the problems arose most after eastward travel, with very limited effects after westward travel, consistent with the greater than 24-hour cycle length of the human circadian clock. OK, but how do you treat it? First, you need to figure out if it needs treating at all. If you're just traveling 1 or 2 time zones, you don't have to worry about it. If you're crossing 3 or more time zones, like traveling coast to coast, it then depends on how long you plan on staying. If it's just a few days, it's probably not worth treating it, since then you'll have to switch back as soon as you get back home. If you have control over your schedule, it's better to time appointments in the new time zone to coincide with daytime back home, so it's pretty much common sense. If you travel east, your body will still think it should be sleeping in the morning, so you should push stuff later, and vice versa. But if you're going to be gone a while, you can adjust your body clock using behavioral methods and/or drugs, supplements, or foods. There's only one surefire way to avoid jet lag altogether, and that's to adapt to the new time zone before your trip. However, changing your home sleep schedule more than a few hours can be counterproductive by interfering with your pre-trip sleep, and you don't want to be going into a long trip already sleep-deprived. Before your trip, you want to maximize your sleep. In flight, the recommendation is to immediately adjust to the destination meal schedule, easier said than done, and then once you land, you want to try to maintain the destination sleep schedule. Try not to nap more than a few minutes, and you don't want to be driving around when your body thinks it's the middle of the night. But the key to treating jet lag is light therapy. Going east, you expose yourself to bright light in the morning and avoid bright light in the evening, and vice versa going west. But it's more complicated than that. The advice switches if you're traveling through more than 6 time zones, because your biological clock may then adjust in the wrong direction. And it's even more complicated than that. The effects of light acting upon the body clock is only actually during a specific window, around the time your body temperature bottoms out. This is usually around 4 a.m. You drop from 98.6 down to like 97.6, even when you're not sleeping. It's just part of our circadian rhythm. The bottom line is, here are the 2 cheat sheets you can take a snapshot of for future reference. So, for example, if you fly from LA to London, 8 time zones east, you'd avoid light between 6 a.m. and noon local time, and expose yourself to light between noon and 6 p.m. local. And the rest of the day, it doesn't matter and won't affect you either way. OK, but that's just on day 1. On subsequent days, the local times of light avoidance and exposure need to be advanced earlier by 1 to 2 hours each day until light avoidance coincides with when you're sleeping. But on those first few days after traveling east, you'll note you're going to want to be avoiding morning light, which can be difficult if that's when your flight gets in. One thing you can do is wear really dark glasses until you get indoors, but if they're too dark, you can't really drive. So that's where these kind of ugly orange lenses that block blue wavelengths can come in handy, preventing the dip in melatonin you get just wearing regular sunglasses. Regardless, the next day, I know there's the urge to get out and about, but that could actually make your jet lag worse by taking you in the opposite direction. What about if you're flying more than 8 time zones east? Then you subtract the number from 24 and treat it as travel west. So a 10 time zone trip to the east, like New York to Delhi, should be treated as a westward flight, requiring a delay in your body clock across 14 time zones. In that case, it would be easy to get outside and get some sun, but if you just went 4 time zones west and need to get light in the middle of the night, what do? A gadget company came up with light-emitting headphones, the theory being you could bathe your brain in light directly through the ear canals. They stuck them in the heads of cadavers and did seem to get some light penetration, but you don't know until you put it to the test. This randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial demonstrated that transcranial bright light exposure via the ear canals could alleviate jet lag symptoms, or you could just turn on a lamp. If you're crossing 3 more time zones, and you plan on staying at your destination long enough to make it worthwhile, you can adjust your body clock to the new time with behavioral methods or pharmacological methods. The behavioral method is light exposure and light avoidance at specific times of the day, based on which direction you're going and how many time zones you cross. You may want to take a snapshot of this table for future reference. The pharmacological intervention is melatonin, the so-called darkness hormone. It's secreted by a little gland in the center of your head as soon as it gets dark, and shuts off when the sun comes up in the morning, thereby helping to set your circadian rhythm. There's been a lot of research done on treating jet lag, but most of it has come from lab rats instead of people. But most of the handful of human trials that have been done have found taking melatonin close to the target bedtime at the destination to try to sync your body to the new time can effectively decrease jet lag symptoms after long flights. Now, unlike most, or really all other drugs, the timing of the dose is critical and determines the effect. Given at the wrong time, it can make your jet lag even worse. For example, if you were to take melatonin at bedtime when traveling west. Dose-wise, taking between 0.5 and 5 milligrams seems to be similarly effective in terms of helping with jet lag symptoms, but the higher dose does seem to have more of kind of a sleeping pill type effect, which appears to plateau at about 5 milligrams. But those are massive doses. Even just taking a 3 milligram dose produces levels in the bloodstream 50 times higher than normal nightly levels. Yeah, it works, but we don't know how safe that is. After all, melatonin in the early days used to be known as the anti-gonad hormone, with human equivalent doses of just a milligram or two, reducing the size of sex organs and impairing fertility in laboratory animals. Now, obviously, rats aren't people, but considering the pronounced effects of melatonin on reproductive physiology in other mammals, to assume that it would not have some sexual effects in humans would almost seem naive. In fact, they speculate maybe melatonin could one day play a role as some sort of contraceptive agent. Wouldn't we know about these effects, though? Well, how? Melatonin is available over-the-counter as a dietary supplement, so there's no post-marketing surveillance like there is with prescription drugs. And then there's the purity problem. Supplements are so poorly regulated that you never really know what's actually in them. For these reasons, melatonin supplements cannot be recommended. Is the purity issue just theoretical, though? You don't know until you put it to the test. And indeed, due to the poor quality control of over-the-counter melatonin, what they say is often not what you get. Melatonin is not only one of the most popular supplements among adults, but children too, which makes it even more egregious that actual melatonin content varied up to nearly 500% compared to what it actually said on the label, based on an analysis of 31 different brands, and most had just a fraction of what they said. And the most variable sample was a chewable tablet, which is what kids might take. It said it had 1.5 milligrams, but actually had 9, which could result in 100 times higher than natural levels. In short, there was no guarantee of the strength or purity of over-the-counter melatonin, leading these researchers to suggest it should be regulated as a drug so that, by law, at least it would have what it says on the bottle. OK, but that's strength. What about purity? 4 of 6 melatonin products from health food stores, 2/3, contained unidentified impurities. With no exclusive patent, no pharmaceutical company wants to pay for the necessary toxicological studies. The stuff is just sold so dirt cheap. They recommend buying it from some large, reputable pharmacy chain and just hoping for the best, but this study suggests it's not worth the risk. Contaminants present in tryptophan supplements were reported to be responsible for a 1980s outbreak of a disease that affected more than 1,000 people and resulted in dozens of deaths. Given the structural similarities of tryptophan and melatonin, maybe when you're trying to synthesize melatonin, those same toxic contaminants could be created. And indeed, here's the contaminant blamed on the tryptophan epidemic. And here's what they found in melatonin supplements. That's a little too close for comfort, suggesting melatonin supplements may just be another accident, another epidemic waiting to happen. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee of the strength or purity of over-the-counter melatonin supplements, which have been found to contain impurities that raise serious safety questions. For these reasons, melatonin supplements cannot be recommended. Too bad there's no way you could get the benefits without the risks, unless melatonin was somehow found naturally in certain foods you could eat. Melatonin was first discovered in plants in 1995, and has since been found throughout the plant kingdom. But enough that eating them actually affects your levels? Yes. You randomize people to eat more or less vegetables, and you can see the effect. Hard to get people to eat vegetables, though. How about beer? The melatonin present in beer contributes to increases in the level of melatonin in the human bloodstream, though alcohol consumption may actually mess with your own endogenous melatonin secretion, so beer probably isn't the best choice. Eat 2 bananas, or drink the juice of about 2 pounds of oranges or pineapple, and you can get significant bumps in melatonin concentrations in your blood. And the melatonin levels found in those fruits are actually pretty modest compared to some other foods. Here's the breakdown. The single food within each category with the highest recorded melatonin level, and how much you'd have to eat at one time to reach a physiological dose in your bloodstream. We make melatonin, so it should come to no surprise that other animals do too. The most melatonin-rich meat tested was salmon, but because there's only billions of a gram per serving, you'd have to sit down and eat about 200 pounds to get the effect. OK, so forget meat. What about whole grains? The highest recorded was a strain of corn, so rich in melatonin you'd only have to eat 16 ears of corn. All right, scratch that. What about other vegetables? Plain white button mushrooms top the list, only 2 pounds. 100 times more melatonin than meat, but still, they're so light. 2 pounds is like eating 10 cups of mushrooms. That's a lot in one sitting. Thankfully, cranberries to the rescue, the most melatonin-rich fruit, just a single ounce, and it's like you just took a melatonin supplement, with only good side effects, other than, of course, the extreme sourness. That's about 1/3 of a cup of cranberries. They're pretty sturdy, so you could travel with them without them getting smushed. But what do you do with them once you get there? Easy to blend into a smoothie, but what if you're stuck in a hotel? Can you eat dried cranberries, like, what are they called, craisins? A study of various tart cherry products suggests that the drying process wipes out the melatonin, so no melatonin in dried cherries, and presumably dried cranberries either, nor in juice. The level of melatonin in cherry juice concentrate was almost non-detectable, so drinking cranberry juice would also presumably be a wash. Which brings us to nuts. Pistachios are not just the most melatonin-rich nut, they are simply off the charts as the most melatonin-rich food ever recorded. To get a physiological dose of melatonin, all you have to do is eat 2. What? 2 what? No, just 2 pistachios. Check it out. Here's the data. More than 200 micrograms of melatonin per gram, 0.2 milligrams per gram. And you can get the normal daily spike your brain gives you taking just 0.3 micrograms, so just 2 nuts. So taking a whole handful of pistachio nuts is like taking one of those high-dose melatonin supplements. So the best food for jet lag appears to be appropriately timed pistachios. Depression is a debilitating mental disorder with severe impairment to quality of life. The drugs don't work particularly well, have a bunch of side effects, so searching for alternative antidepressant agents with proper efficacy and safety is necessary. Well, there is this green algae called chlorella that's been used as a dietary supplement in alternative medicine in Asia for centuries. Why not put it to the test? A randomized controlled trial of chlorella in patients with major depression. Subjects were randomized to standard therapy or standard therapy plus 1,800 milligrams of chlorella, which is about 3/4 of a teaspoon a day, and significant improvements in physical and cognitive symptoms of depression, as well as anxiety. Wow. OK, but what word is missing here? A randomized controlled trial of chlorella. What we want is a randomized placebo-controlled trial. Here they compared chlorella to nothing. Half got some special treatment, the other half got nothing. The perfect setup for the placebo effect, especially when the measured outcomes are mostly just about how they're subjectively feeling. Now, you could argue, look, that much chlorella would only cost about 10 cents a day. It's healthy for you anyway, and depression is such a serious disease, why not just give it a try? OK, but I'd still like to know if it actually works or not. This other study on chlorella I highlighted suffered from a similar problem, but at least had an objective quantifiable outcome, a significant decrease in liver inflammation. But this study had no control group at all, so maybe they just would have gotten better on their own for some reason. But there's never been a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of chlorella for liver disease until now. And not just any liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which, thanks to the obesity pandemic, now affects 1 in 4 people on Earth. Let's see if 1,200 milligrams of chlorella a day will help. It's about a half teaspoon, closer to just a nickel a day, and significant drops in liver inflammation, perhaps because they lost significantly more weight, about a pound a week over the 8 weeks, which would explain the significant improvement in fasting blood sugars. They conclude that chlorella has significant weight-reducing effects with meaningful improvements in liver function. How about a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study of chlorella for cholesterol? Compared with the control group, the chlorella group exhibited remarkable changes in total cholesterol. Wow, how much? Only 1.6%. What? And note they said total cholesterol. If you look at what really matters, LDL cholesterol, no effect whatsoever. Thankfully, that's not what other studies found. A meta-analysis of 19 randomized controlled trials of chlorella for cholesterol, involving hundreds of subjects, found that those taking chlorella did drop their LDL 8 points on average, and even drop their blood pressure a few points. 4 grams or more a day for at least 8 weeks seems to be the magic formula. That would be about 2 teaspoons a day. That's a lot of chlorella, but if you can find a palatable way to take it, it might help. This is the latest, a dietary cholesterol challenge. They had people eat 3 eggs a day, with or without a few spoonfuls of chlorella. In this double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study, 34 participants ingested 510 milligrams of dietary cholesterol from 3 eggs, concomitantly with a dose of chlorella or a matched placebo for 4 weeks. Just eating the eggs alone, 14% rise in LDL cholesterol, but with the chlorella, significantly less. Therefore, chlorella can be playing a useful role in maintaining healthy blood cholesterol levels. Another way would be to not eat 3 eggs a day. That reminds me of this other study to assess the ability of chlorella to detoxify carcinogenic heterocyclic amines, the cancer-causing chemicals created when you fry, bake, broil, or barbecue meat. The chlorella did seem to lower the levels of one of the cooked meat carcinogens flowing through their bodies, but didn't quite reach statistical significance. Or what about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, another class of cancer-causing compounds found particularly in smoked meats, cigarettes, includes numerous genotoxic, DNA-damaging carcinogens, and again, chlorella did seem to lower levels, but not significantly so. Still, if you're gonna sit down to like ham and eggs for breakfast or something, make sure to add lots of chlorella and make them green eggs and ham. The average adult uses 9 personal care products each day, with 126 unique chemical ingredients. Now, we used to think that anything applied to the skin would always just remain on the surface, and the only thing you had to worry about was like local skin irritation. But over recent decades, we started to recognize that some topically applied substances can penetrate into, or even through, human skin, and end up circulating throughout our bodies. Take the toxic heavy metal lead, for example. To see if lead could be absorbed through the skin into the body, researchers applied lead to someone's left arm, and then they measured the lead in the sweat coming off their right arm over the next few days. There was a big spike, proving nearly 30 years ago that lead can be absorbed through the skin and rapidly distributed throughout the body. This led to public health authorities to recommend parents avoid using cosmetics, at least on their children, that could be contaminated. Which cosmetics might those be? Lead has been found in a wide range of cosmetic products because it's a natural constituent of many color pigments. The FDA has set an upper limit for lead at 20 parts per million, and though only some samples of henna exceeded that, because henna is used for temporary tattoos, these quantities of lead can remain on the skin for a long time and may not be safe. Because studies show that lead may have no identifiable safe exposure level, with even the lowest levels shown to affect the brains of developing children, thus the use of henna, especially among children, may constitute a public health risk. So increasing awareness of henna's serious toxic implications may help end or at least reduce the use of such hazardous material, especially when children are involved. Now, traditionally, henna was just the dried powdered leaves of some plant, but more recently other ingredients have been added to give it a stronger color. Added ingredients such as lead, one of the most common and egregious additives in henna, but not as common as PPD, paraphenylenediamine. The red paste traditionally used, known as red henna, rarely produces adverse effects, but to achieve a darker pigment, known as black henna, various additives may be used, including animal urine, but better P than PPD, a coal tar derivative that can cause nasty skin reactions such as blistering and scarring. PPD is added to speed up the process from as long as 12 hours down to less than 2 hours. So while the use of black hennas may be tempting, it has the potential for both short and long-term side effects. How common are these reactions? The best estimate is about 2.5%. So 1 in 40 kids that gets a black henna tattoo may have an allergic reaction. Unfortunately, this practice has become fashionable. Thanks a lot, Spice Girls. There's no such thing as natural black henna, so perhaps it would be best to respect the more traditional practices, lest a temporary tattoo turn into a permanent scar. The problem is that PPD can be found in products labeled as red henna too, so just because it's red doesn't mean it's not risky. Bad news for the $100 million industry. Because henna of all colors is so often adulterated, under FDA guidelines, henna shouldn't be applied to the skin at all. Is tea tree oil toxic? Anecdotal evidence suggests that the topical use of the oil is relatively safe, and that adverse events are minor, self-limiting, and occasional. Published data, however, adds some caveats. It can be toxic if ingested. It can also cause skin irritation at higher concentrations. Now, normally, tea tree oil reduces skin inflammation. 27 volunteers had histamine injected in their skin, the equivalent of like getting bitten by a fire ant. But the big red swollen marks significantly decreased after the application of tea tree oil. Here's where the bump was at 20 minutes after injection. Apply a placebo oil, and it continues to get worse, before finally beginning to calm down. But if at 20 minutes you apply half of a single drop of pure tea tree oil, it stops the inflammation in its tracks and immediately starts getting better. Some people are sensitive to it, though, and it can instead trigger a rash. This is relatively rare, though, with only about 1% of older children and adults having such a reaction, and none of the 40 younger children tested had a reaction, which is good since it can be found in like 5% of diaper wipes and lotions. Most reactions, when they do occur, are caused by the application of pure oil, and so there are recommendations to keep the concentration of tea tree oil products applied to the skin under 1%. Moreover, manufacturers may want to use antioxidants in dark bottles to minimize exposure to light, since aged oxidized oils are more likely to induce allergic reactions. Hundreds of different compounds have been identified in tea tree oil, but the composition changes when exposed to light, air, humidity, and higher temperatures. It can start turning a green-brownish color, the viscosity changes, and the smell becomes turpentine-like, all bad signs. Even fresh tea tree oil shouldn't be ingested, though. 2 hours before arriving at the pediatric critical care unit, a 4-year-old's mother had given him approximately 2 teaspoons of tea tree oil. Within 30 minutes, he had trouble walking, and shortly thereafter fell into a coma. They note that tea tree oil was in a bottle without a child-proof cap, but it didn't matter in this case because the cap wasn't mother-proof either. Similar cases are reported at even less than 2 teaspoons, though the reported adult poisoning cases have tended to involve larger doses. Thankfully, no human deaths caused by tea tree oil have been reported, though note the qualifier human. It has been implicated in the deaths of pets when used inappropriately when trying to treat fleas or something. Cats in particular are at risk because of their habit of licking their fur. In humans, though, it can apparently be used safely if you avoid ingestion, apply only diluted oil topically, and only use oil that has been stored correctly. Concern has been raised about a possible link between gynecomastia, topical lavender, and tea tree oils. Gynecomastia is the abnormal development of breast tissue. I talked about lavender before, but what about tea tree oil? It all started with a case series published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They described 3 young boys in whom breast growth coincided with the topical application of products that contained lavender and tea tree oils. How do we know they were to blame? Well, the problem resolved in each patient shortly after the use of products containing these oils was stopped. Furthermore, studies in human cell lines indicated that the 2 oils had pro-female hormone and anti-male hormone activities, so they conclude that repeated topical exposure to lavender and tea tree oils probably was the cause. But as a tea tree oil company representative pointed out, only one of the 3 boys was exposed to any amount of tea tree oil, and they were also exposed to lavender oil, so lavender oil may have been to blame in all 3 cases. The researchers responded that, OK, that's a valid argument. However, the tea tree oil did have activity similar to that of lavender oil with respect to the in vitro effects. Let me walk you through those. This is measuring the growth of human breast cancer cells in a petri dish. You drip a tiny amount of estrogen on them, and you can spike their growth, more than a dozenfold. But if you add an estrogen blocker along with the estrogen, it abolishes the effect. OK. Now let's add increasing amounts of tea tree oil to the breast cancer cells. Their growth goes up, and the reason we know it's an estrogenic effect is that when you add the estrogen blocker too, the growth comes down. Pretty convincing. But in vitro testing alone is not adequate grounds for indicting traditionally used products, argued some herbal proponents, including Paula Gardner. I was excited to see one of my medical school classmates and friends. Hi, Paula. Specifically, argued the Tea Tree Oil Industry Association, only a few tea tree oil compounds actually make it through the skin. So what they should have done is just measure the hormonal effects of those 3 compounds, but that had never been done until later that year. Yes, drip increasing concentrations of whole tea tree oil on breast cancer cells in a petri dish, and you can increase their growth compared to an oil with no estrogenic effect, like eucalyptus oil. But if you just look at the 3 components of tea tree oil that actually make it into your bloodstream when you apply it on your skin, none appear to have any estrogenic effects. So none of the components that penetrate the skin appear to act as estrogens, neither alone nor in combination, and so you can't extrapolate the petri dish effects of the whole oil to what one might see when applied on the skin. Thus, what you see in a petri dish may not be identical to what you see in a person. This new data led European consumer safety officials to conclude that a purported link between gynecomastia and the topical use of tea tree oil is therefore considered implausible. In fact, if the anti-male hormone components of tea tree oil remain on the skin, well then, hey, how about using it to treat women who feel they are affected by excessive hairiness? Such women were instructed to spray themselves with a dilute lavender tea tree oil spray versus placebo twice a day on quote-unquote problem areas, morning and evening, for 3 months. Hairs were taken before and after from 4 different body areas: chin, chest, thigh, and upper arms. After 3 months, no change in the hair diameter in the placebo group, as expected, but in the lavender tea tree oil group, all the hairs ended up thinner. This showed that at least the combination of lavender and tea tree oils applied locally on the skin could be effective in reducing mild excessive hairiness, potentially representing a safe, economic, and practical instrument in the cure of this quote-unquote disease. Canker sores can be a painful, recurring inflammatory process of the lining of our mouths, and similar to other chronic inflammatory conditions, DNA damage due to oxidative stress-free radicals is thought to play a role. Normally, free radical production is balanced with antioxidants. However, if the free radical concentration gets too high, and our antioxidant enzymes and the antioxidants we get in our diet cannot adequately compensate for these radicals, the balance is shifted in a pro-oxidant direction, which can lead to oxidative damage within our body. OK, so do those with recurring canker sores have fewer antioxidants, more oxidation, and more DNA damage? Yes, and yes. More pro-oxidants and more oxidative stress in their bloodstream, lower antioxidant status, and more DNA damage, suggesting it might be possible for antioxidants to help, but you don't know until you put it to the test. 16 boys and girls around age 12 with recurring canker sores given a whopping 2 grams of vitamin C a day. That's considered the tolerable upper daily limit for adults before you start getting diarrhea, and 1,200 milligrams may do that in a 12-year-old. But it's all about risks and benefits. How did they do? 15 out of 16 cut the number of canker sores they were getting at least in half. In 3 months before they started the vitamin C, they averaged 4 canker sores, but in 3 months they were on it, had less than 1 on average. Then they tried stopping the C for another 3 months, and the ulcers started coming back, and so they added the C back, and the canker sore rate dropped again. What about applying antioxidants directly, like a turmeric gel, a gel containing 2% curcumin, the yellow pigment of the spice turmeric, swabbed directly onto the canker sores twice a day? It did seem to significantly reduce pain intensity and ulcer size compared to placebo, compared to a gel containing no active ingredient. But it would be nice to see a comparison to some active treatment, and from an independent research group, not funded by the curcumin gel manufacturer. And here it is, a randomized clinical trial, a generic 2% curcumin gel versus a prescription steroid gel. And their curcumin worked just as well, providing strong evidence that it can be used as an effective and safer alternative to steroids for the treatment of recurring canker sores. But if you remember, topical honey beat out the same steroid for both ulcer healing compared to the steroid, and pain reduction compared to the steroid. So if you're going to use something topically, honey seems best, but what if you just want to swallow something instead, but something that doesn't give you diarrhea? 31 patients with recurring canker sores were split up into 2 groups, getting either 20 milligrams of yeast beta-glucan fiber a day or placebo. That's the amount found in just 1/8 of a teaspoon of brewer's yeast or nutritional yeast. In the placebo group, no significant change, whereas in the yeast group, ulcer severity was cut nearly in half, so that's something else you can try. If it's an antioxidant thing, can't you just eat a plant-based diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, and treat it that way? That's never been put to the test, though a plant-based diet could also make things worse if one is not ensuring a regular, reliable source of vitamin B12 through supplements or fortified foods. For example, a 30-year-old woman with 4 years of recurring canker sores, eating so few animal products and no supplementation, she became vitamin B12 deficient, and started feeling weak and tired, numbness and tingling, so they immediately started her on B12, and thankfully her B12 deficiency symptoms got better, but so did her canker sores, a rapid and complete recovery within weeks of starting B12 after years of suffering. We've known B12 deficiency could lead to canker sores since the 70s, so much so that a recommendation has been made to consider B12 deficiency any time you see a patient with recurring canker sores. In fact, a number of nutrient deficiencies may do it. If you compare the lab tests of those with recurrent canker sores to those without, more than half of the canker sore group showed evidence of hematinic deficiencies, in other words, blood-forming nutrient deficiencies, compared to less than 1 in 10 in the non-canker sore group. So we're talking like iron deficiency and folate deficiency, in addition to B12 deficiency. So they gave them supplements, and their canker sores improved, especially among those who didn't have a family history of canker sore problems. OK, so you could see how vitamin and mineral supplements might help people who are deficient, but might a supplement like vitamin B12 help even in people not B12 deficient? Apparently so. As the title says, cyanocobalamin, the most common form of supplemental B12, may be beneficial in the treatment of recurrent canker sores even when vitamin B12 levels are normal. They took a group of 72 patients with frequent canker sores and gave them B12, regardless of what their levels were, and in 96% of cases they got better. And that was among both those who started out deficient and those who started out with regular B12 levels in their blood. But there was no control group, so you don't know how many would have gotten better anyway, and they injected the B12, and injections can have an even greater placebo effect than pills, especially perhaps with something like B12, which has a striking mad scientist-looking ruby red color in the syringe. But there had never been a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of oral B12 for canker sores until there was. 1,000 micrograms of sublingual B12 a day for 6 months. And it took 5 months, but eventually the duration of canker outbreaks, the number of ulcers, and the level of pain were significantly reduced. And again, regardless of the initial vitamin B12 levels in their blood. So B12 deficient or not, vitamin B12 supplements seemed to help. By the end of the study, twice as many in the B12 group appeared to have been cured. So vitamin B12 supplements represent a simple, inexpensive, low-risk, effective treatment, though it appeared to take months before it starts working. Whereas if you apply B12 directly to the canker sore, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of a B12 ointment applied directly to the canker sores, you can get at least significant reduction in pain within 2 days compared to placebo, and again, it doesn't matter whether you're vitamin B12 deficient or not. In 1982, a landmark report on diet, nutrition, and cancer was released by the National Academy of Sciences, the first major institutional science-based report on the topic. The report started out saying that yes, scientists must be careful in their choice of words whenever they're not totally confident about their conclusions, but, for example, by that time, it had become absolutely clear that cigarettes were killing people. But had the population been persuaded to stop smoking when the association between lung cancer was first reported, these cancer deaths would not now have been occurring. If you wait for absolute certainty, millions of people could die in the meanwhile. That's why sometimes you have to invoke the precautionary principle. For example, emphasizing fruits and vegetables may reduce the risk of several common forms of cancer. We're not completely sure, but there's good evidence. And what's the downside of eating more fruits and vegetables? So why not give it a try? The 1982 National Academy of Sciences report continued, the public is now asking about the causes of cancer that are not associated with smoking. What are these causes, and how can these cancers be avoided? Unfortunately, it's not yet possible to make firm scientific pronouncements about the association between diet and cancer. We're in that interim stage of knowledge similar to that for cigarettes 20 years ago. Therefore, in the judgment of the committee, it is now the time to offer some interim guidelines on diet and cancer. For example, they raised concern about processed meats, and 30 years later it was confirmed. Processed meat was officially declared carcinogenic in humans. Maybe if we had listened back then, maybe we would have been spared Lunchables, which, if taken apart, CEO Philip Morris describes reading, the most healthy item in it is the napkin. The findings of this diet and cancer report generated a striking level of disbelief from the cancer community and outright hostility from people and the industries whose livelihood depended on the foods being questioned, to the point of accusing one of the authors of the report of killing people, with formally organized petitions to expel the researchers from their professional societies. Clearly, a very sensitive nerve was touched. The American Meat Science Association and other members of the Council for Agricultural Sciences and Technology criticized the report. Yeah, maybe it would save lives, but the recommended reductions in meat consumption would sharply reduce incomes to the livestock and meat processing industries. The fruit and vegetable industries would clearly benefit if consumers were to implement the guidelines. However, fruit and vegetables account for less than 15% of cash receipts. Most of the money is in cattle, hogs, poultry products, feed grains, and oil crops. It reminds me of the tobacco industry memos, where Philip Morris spoke of the tobacco industry going bankrupt. Maybe it's not the meat that's causing cancer, the industry critique continued, but all the marijuana people are smoking these days. How can one argue that such an abundant diet causes cancer? Maybe they're just all jealous of all the good food we're eating, like the Puritans that condemned bear baiting, not because of the pain for the bear, but because of the pleasure of the spectators. You can't tell us to cut down on meat. One of mankind's few remaining pleasures is that of the table. The day the National Academy of Sciences report was published was the day that food was declared a poison, declared Thomas Jukes, the guy who discovered you could speed up the growth of chickens by feeding them antibiotics. How dare the National Academy of Sciences recommend people eat fruits, vegetables, and whole grains daily, which were said to contain as yet unidentified compounds that may protect us against certain cancers? How can one select foods that contain unidentified compounds? This is not a scientific recommendation. It sounds like health food store literature. My favorite, though, was think about the human breast. How can animal fat be bad for us if breastfeeding women create so much of it? Women are animals. Their mammary glands make fat for breast milk. Therefore, we shouldn't have to cut down on burgers? Huh? So anyway, what does the latest science tell us about nutrition and cancer? What are the other 5 recommendations? We talked about eating more fruits and vegetables. Consumption of soy products may not only reduce the risk of getting breast cancer, but also surviving it. And then in terms of dietary guidance suggestions on foods to cut down on, where evidence is sufficiently compelling, include limiting or avoiding dairy products to reduce the risk of prostate cancer, limiting or avoiding alcohol to reduce the risk of cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, colon, rectum, and breast, avoiding red and processed meat to reduce the risk of cancers of the colon and rectum, and avoiding grilled, fried, and broiled meats to reduce the risk of cancers of the colon, rectum, breast, prostate, kidney, and pancreas. And in this context, they're talking about all meat, including poultry and fish. Look, we all have to make dietary decisions every day. We can't wait for the evolution of scientific consensus, and until we know more, to protect ourselves and our families. All we can do is act on the best available evidence we have right now.